what I'm going to talk about is something that it's a phrase that some of you may be familiar with. If not, well, we'll give you a definition. I'm going to give you a couple of guidelines as to how competitive intelligence is done. I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then give you some war stories that I think will illustrate the way companies in different cultures and companies in different countries look at competitive intelligence, and how you need to look at competitors, for that matter, when you're looking outside of your own home country, no matter where your home country happens to be. I worked past tense for Fuld and Company, which is in Boston. It's moved just recently from Cambridge. It's been around for 37 years as a leader in the field of competitive intelligence, really a pioneer. And my former partner, Leonard Fuld, has written 4 books on the topic, and is working on a 5th that, at least theoretically, I'm supposed to be helping him with. So when that comes out, I'll send you a copy and see if we can get some sales. So what is competitive intelligence? Well, it's information that has been refined to the point where it can be used to make a decision. And it's, of course, information about the competition or about the marketplace, what a competitor can do, what they might do, what they have done in the past, something that will help you make a decision about your organization. And you hear terms like business intelligence and business analytics and competitor as opposed to competitive intelligence. They're all pretty much synonyms for the same thing, trying to get an understanding of what a competitor's capabilities are, what they're going to do, why they've done something, so that you can do something with foreknowledge and understanding of them, and hopefully be more successful in the marketplace. So let me start sort of by giving you an example from the world of pepperoni. And I don't know if you're familiar with, well, you're all familiar with pepperoni on a pizza, right? But pepperoni, the pepperoni that comes to you on a pizza from a pizza shop has actually been produced in a factory in the Middle West, and at least if it's in the United States. And traditional pepperoni is a mix of meat and spices, and it's not cooked. It's hung up to dry. It dries for typically about a month. And it's cured by hanging it in a dry, cool place. And I visited the company that retained Fuld & Company to figure out what was going on with the competitor, because they had a competitor who was selling pepperoni that appeared to be of equivalent quality, had the same spice content, the same meat fiber, and so forth, and yet they were selling it for 10% less. And the client couldn't figure that out, and so the first thing was, well, I got to walk through the pepperoni factory, which is a pretty interesting experience, because you walk into a room in which, well, the company made 60 million pounds of pepperoni a year, so if it takes a month to dry, there were 5 million pounds of pepperoni hanging up in a building about the size of an airplane hangar. And you walk into that building, and the aroma of pepperoni was just overwhelming. I can still smell pepperoni. Anyway, it was a very aromatic experience. And this competitor had been selling pepperoni of equivalent quality, and so the question is, what was going on? So you folks are all in business. You all have competition. Price is always a factor in business. Any ideas about what somebody might be doing? What do you think someone who's facing this kind of competitor says about the competitor? What would you say?
Cutting corners.
Cutting corners, okay. Well, pepperoni is round, so it's, you know, but yeah, that's exactly what people will typically say. They're doing something different. They're not putting the full quality in it, something of that sort. Okay, good. Any other thoughts about that? Yep.
They're cutting price to take share.
Cutting price to take share, another standard thing. Now, these people had been doing this for about 8 years, and they had built up to about 30% market share, maybe a little bit more than that. So the question is, well, if they were doing that, you know, at some point, you have to make a profit at some point. So, go ahead.
They're doing something, new processes to be more efficient.
Something new to be more efficient, okay, which is, now usually what happens is when you have a competitor like that, Internally, you say they're cutting corners or they're trying to build share, and you get some consultant from Cambridge, Massachusetts comes and says, they must be doing something different. And the answer is, we're the best. We invented this process. And in fact, this company had invented the process for mass producing pepperoni. Well, okay. Where do you think you might go to find out what's actually going on? Association, so the International Association of Pepperoni Producers, right? All right. And possibility the association would know a little bit. They would certainly know something about the management of the company, how long they've been in business. Go ahead. Yep.
Read press release, find out who they hired, where they came from, what kind of equipment they recently bought.
All right. Right to the heart of the matter. So who have they hired? Where did the people come from? And the equipment is very, very interesting because in this particular case, the company was in Fort Worth, Texas. And so we went to Fort Worth, Texas, and we did not visit the competitor. This is not corporate espionage. This is competitive intelligence. Didn't visit the competitor. Instead, we went to the building department in Fort Worth. And we said in advance, we made arrangements, found out that they had building plans. And the building plans showed the layout of the manufacturing facility. And we got there and looked at it and said, this doesn't look anything like our client's facility. And there were some notations on the building plan that said concrete footers or machine footings detailed to be provided by such and such a machine manufacturer. Researcher called up the machine manufacturer and essentially said, what do you make? And the answer was, well, we make ovens that are typically used to cook hot dogs. And okay, so there's a disconnect here because pepperoni is not cooked, it's dried. Anyway, to make a long story short, or at least a little shorter, it turned out that these people had figured out that if they put the pepperoni into a hot dog oven at, I believe the temperature was 170 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, they could begin to advance the curing so that they only had to cure it for 2 weeks instead of a month. And that meant that they had only a half an airplane hanger full of pepperoni hanging up to dry, 2.5 million pounds instead of 5. That they had heat, light, and power for a building that was half the size, and taxes that were that much less. And if you looked at this and you looked at the cost structure that would flow out of doing it this way, you could see that there were a number of things that could add up to them making a profit at that lower price. And that was, you have exactly the right answer. Look outside, find out who interacts with the company, and see what you can learn from them. And that's usually the best way to find out what's going on inside, but you have to have an open mind in order to do it. And when we got to this company originally, we sat around a long table. The CEO was at one end of the table with the R&D director who said their product is identical to ours, and I and one of my researchers was at the other end, and the marketing people were on one side and the operations people were on the other side of the table facing each other, and the marketing people were said to the operations people after a rather feverish discussion about, what could they possibly be doing differently. The marketing people said to the operations people, you just don't know how to make this stuff. And the operations director said to the marketing vice president, you don't know how to sell it. Okay. That's the kind of thing that typically happens in a company until you say, well, wait a sec, let's look outside. So competitive intelligence is all about looking outside.
What did they do?
Good question. What did they do? They made some significant changes in their process, I guess is the best way to put it. But it took them some time. The operations director, when he got the report and it was delivered in person, actually he stood up and he was so angry and so upset, he walked out of the room and calmed down, sat down with his labor force. He sat down with his CFO. They made some investments. They did some things with labor that reduced their costs.
For once, marketing was right.
For once, marketing was right. A rare occurrence. So, I never want to talk about competitive intelligence without talking at least a little bit about the rules around competitive intelligence. And I've just sort of given you in general terms, the things that you can probably derive the rules from. So one thing is you have to obey the law. But you also have to behave ethically. That is, you have to do things that are viewed as being okay within the context of the country and the industry. So you would do things somewhat differently in India or Saudi Arabia or China than you would do in Germany or in the US because the contexts are different. But it's always important to remember that context. And in terms of obeying the law, of course, if you're a US company, you have to obey the law that requires you to follow the same practices overseas as you follow in North America with regard to bribery and that sort of thing. But you have to behave ethically, and you have to do things that you're comfortable doing. And so I want to give you an illustration of what I mean by behaving legally, ethically, and comfortably, and how that sort of, there's a zone in which those things cross, but there are things that are legal that you really wouldn't think are ethical. And there are things that people are comfortable doing that aren't legal and of questionable ethical nature. And for example, it's against the law to speed, right? How many of you have never driven faster than the speed limit? Anybody? Come on, you know? So that it just doesn't happen, and we're all comfortable doing that once in a while, and most of us in Massachusetts are comfortable doing that all the time. So it's an example of something that's not legal. I don't know about the ethical part, but most people are comfortable with it. I'll give you one other example. Adultery. Ah, there we go. Okay, so adultery is legal in most jurisdictions. Right? Let's get serious here. Adultery is legal in most jurisdictions. How many of you are comfortable? Never mind. Right. So, but you get the point. Lots of people are comfortable committing adultery, even though it's clearly not ethical, and in most places it is legal. So it's the confluence of these three boxes that you want to stay in whenever you're trying to learn about a competitor, understand what the competitor is up to, and if you say to yourself, well, okay, I don't want to do anything that would look bad if it was on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper, that's probably the best guidance you can give yourself. Now, you have to remember that not everybody has the same high standards of ethics that you do. And I want to give you an example, and it's actually a local example. In 1992, American Airlines put on nonstop flights in and out of San Jose from several cities where there was a substantial information technology industry. And Boston was one of them, and the plane very quickly got a nickname called the Nerdbird. Because naturally, if you were going back and forth from Boston to San Jose, you were a nerd. And people very quickly learned that on that plane were their competitors, their customers, their venture capital partners, the journalists who looked at the industry. It was full of IT people, and they learned to be very circumspect about what they said and about what was on their laptop screens and so forth. And there was one guy who was interviewed by the magazine that wrote an article about the Nerdbird, and he said, well, one day he was sitting on the plane, and as it was taking off, a 3-ring binder slipped down from underneath the seat in front of him. And he looked at it and picked it up, and it had the name of his arch competitor, strategic marketing plan for the following year, and it turned out that the vice president of marketing was sitting in the seat in front of him. And the reporter said, what did you do with it? And he said, I read it. I flipped through it as quickly as I can to see if I could find some, looked at the charts and so forth. I put it down and slipped it back under the seat. Is that something that you would be comfortable doing? Personally, I hope not, but it's awfully tempting. There are places where taking that sort of information or going out and trying to steal it is something that happens. Now, that crosses the boundary from competitive intelligence over into economic espionage, and we don't want to go there. But just remember that there are people, you're surrounded by them in business, who don't have the same standards as you do. So, let's move from that topic to the topic of, okay, now how do I understand, if I'm going to do this properly, how do I understand, is there some kind of framework I can use to figure out what my competitor is likely to do? And the model that we typically go back to is Michael Porter's Four Corners model. If are any of you familiar with Michael Porter's work? Okay. So Porter works over at the Harvard Business School, and in 1980 he wrote a book called Competitive Strategy, and he talked about the forces that affect competition in an industry, the so-called five forces model, and he provided this Four Corners model for understanding what a company's future strategy was going to be. And he said that the future strategy would be dependent on management's goals, or drivers as he called them, and I think he used an unfortunate word. I think goals is a much better word. What their current strategy is, because in fact no organization, especially a large organization, can change its strategy dramatically in a short time. What are their resources, and what's their culture like? What are they likely to do? Are they a conservative organization? Do they compete very fiercely? What's their attitude about the world? And what culture do they work in if they're international? And what do they believe about the future? What assumptions do they have? And assumptions are sometimes the sort of the dark corner of the Four Corners analysis, because we don't really think about our assumptions, and we don't often think about our competitors' assumptions. But let's take a couple of examples. So let's think about the market for automobiles. What do you think about the market? What do you assume? What do you believe about the future of the market for automobiles? Let's pick a region. In South Asia, India, Pakistan. What do you think about that market? It's going to continue to grow,
Yeah.
fairly rapidly probably.
Exactly.
Okay. Something else about the market?
Small cars.
Cars will typically start off with smaller cars, right? You may want to think about, well, who are the companies that are well positioned, and are they going to continue to be well positioned? How much protection will governments give or continue to give to local manufacture? And how will that change over time? Yeah.
I read a story on the fact that, I forget which country it was, but they had to allow more room in the backseat because they had more people like drivers. And so they had to allow that the person driving who owned the car wasn't always the person driving. They wanted to be sitting in the backseat. So to allow extra leg space
Okay.
in the
So
back.
in some situations when a person who can afford a car can also afford somebody to drive it for him.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay. And I've been in India a few times, and most of the time, if I'm with somebody, they do have a driver. So today, more and more people are driving themselves, but certainly years back that was true, and it still is true to some extent. Drivers are cheap. In fact, the drivers are cheaper than the cars.
Yeah.
Okay. So you therefore have to design a car that fits, so that you can stretch out a little bit in the back. All right, that's interesting. So one question is, well, if I'm thinking about the automobile market, what is it that's going to change over time that will get built into my future strategy? And if you can look at first your own organization and then at your competitor's organization using this model, you can usually figure out with a reasonable level of accuracy, if you're really hard-nosed and honest about the drivers and the assumption side, and for that matter the capability side, you can usually figure out the general direction that a competitor is going to go in. And if you go through a war game process, this is the heart of a war game. You actually sit down and work through these exercises in teams, and it's a very powerful way to figure out what competitors are going to do. So now that I've given you that sort of context of the way we like to think about trying to understand competitors, I'm going to give you three stories. This is Corning. Corning Glass in upstate New York, which invented pyroceram, the ceramic cooktop in the 1960s. And Corning's an innovator in glass and ceramics, and they began to sell these cooktops to appliance manufacturers and built a very substantial market. And 1970s, the 1970s advertising phrase was the counter that cooks. Schott is a major glass manufacturer based in Mainz, Germany, and it's one of Corning's global rivals pretty much across the board in virtually all product areas. And Schott started to target Corning one product line at a time, including the pyroceramic product line. And they would lower the price to the point where Corning just wouldn't be able to compete. And they would do this in a segment, and then Corning would leave, abandon the segment, and Schott would then raise their own prices. They'd, after having pushed Corning out, and they'd go on to some other product segment. And by the early 1980s, Corning, who had invented this product, had to abandon it. And the question is, how could Schott, operating in a high-cost environment, manage this price war tactic time after time? Any thoughts? Any ideas?
They drew from the rest of their organization to fund it.
Okay, so they did that, and that's exactly what they did. Tell me a little bit about the structure of the business that will allow them to do that.
They organized their product cost structure so that even if they sold it at a low price, it was still profitable?
No, they were actually willing to take zero margin or less than zero margin in a particular product line as long as the group was performing. So,
Yeah, but that's dumping.
I'm sorry?
That's dumping.
It's dumping. Yeah, it probably is dumping. It's producing, selling at below, but dumping is if you sell below domestic price as opposed to domestic cost. You can take a loss as long as you take it equally across all of your geographic regions. So, in any case, Corning didn't attack them on the basis of dumping, perhaps because of that reason. So, think about, we think about doing business internationally, and we think, you have to think about how business is done in Saudi Arabia or how that business is done in Kazakhstan or whatever. You also have to think about the different culture in different companies. General Electric has a policy that every product has to make a profit. And if one GE division sells a product to another GE division so that they can be packaged together for some larger contract, it's transferred at market price, not at producer price. Which means that when GE goes to bid on certain kinds of large industrial contracts, it's at a huge disadvantage compared to Emerson Electric, which doesn't do that. They look at the whole package. That's what Schott was doing. And so, at the very basic level, thinking about about differences between corporations, never mind the geographic or the international differences, think about the differences in the way company finances are structured and the way company P&Ls are structured, because that will influence strategy. And where does that go back? How does that go back to that Four Corners model? What are the management's goals? Well, management's goals, in the case of Corning, were to make a profit on every single product line. And if we can't make a profit, we're getting out. And Schott's were, let's make a product in this segment. Very different approach. And you think, well, Schott's right, but Corning has been successful for a long time. There must be some advantage to what they've done. So, during the normal business review, Corning's management would focus on individual Schott products, not all of its, and not its revenue or profitability across all segments, and that's a quote from a guy named Gary Roush, who for years was the head of competitive intelligence at Corning. And Corning had knowledge silos, they had this accounting culture that they really couldn't overcome, and Schott was aware of that and took advantage of it. And as a partial solution, Roush tried to break down the silos so that they exchanged information across product lines, but in fact he really never could break down that accounting structure. Corning has remained a very successful company, or it's had its ups and downs, but today it's a relatively successful company. But still, there's a focus on profitability by product line, and as a consequence, it very often will abandon a product line in order to pull out of an area that it might very well get an advantage from if it stayed in and subsidized as part of a larger strategic effort. So, that is a little bit of a discussion about the corporate culture. Let's talk a little bit about on the national side. Fujitsu Research worked with my company in the mid 1990s, and they said to us, identify a U.S. firm that manages innovation well and that has been successful in technology. And so, and we said, well, any particular? No, you figure out which company you want. So we looked at a number of these companies, and so what companies have done well managing innovation, and which of them are analogous to Fujitsu, because we wanted to have some connection. So, for example, we wouldn't have looked at Genentech. That wouldn't have made a great deal of sense. And ultimately, well, who would you choose as an analog to Fujitsu? What do you think? HP, Motorola, okay. Well, we chose Intel, actually, and the reason we chose Intel was that we felt like they had been the most successful at managing innovation. Although I would agree with you that Motorola and HP in particular are probably more analogous to Fujitsu in terms of their range of businesses. We went to Intel, and we talked to people at Intel, and we didn't say to Intel, we're doing this for Fujitsu. We called up people, engineers and engineering managers at Intel, and we said, we're very interested in understanding how you manage innovation. And the technology world is an interesting place because people in technology, people in science, love to talk about their work. And they're not particularly sensitive to business confidentiality or sort of soft confidential issues as opposed to hard ones. They won't give you the code or the computer code or the design of the chip, but they'll tell you how they do things. And so people talk to us about the fact that at Intel, if you had an idea for a project, you could get funding up to a fairly high level with a fairly, just a middle manager's signature. And you didn't have to go all the way up to the board or anything of that sort. But the deal was that if the project wasn't going well after a certain point, you had to step forward and say, this isn't going well, take the money back. And if that happened, your career wasn't damaged, there was nothing, no black mark against you, you just went on, found the next project. Okay? If, on the other hand, you continued to run a project that you knew wasn't going anywhere and you used up the budget, you were in trouble. So you couldn't run something into the ground. If you could see that it was going to run into the ground, that wasn't going to work. And in fact, we had numbers like, well, I can get money, I can get up to $2 million for a project budget in order to get something like this started with just the division managers sign off. And we put all that together and we went back to Fujitsu and we said, here's what they do. And Fujitsu read the report in great detail. I mean, they looked at every comma and every period in that report. They really looked, they practically took the ink off the pages, and they came back to us and they said, very interesting. Unfortunately, this doesn't do us any good. We are not structured so that we can do it that way. And the guy that I was working with, Japanese, showed me his travel authorization from the company, and it had 9 little round rubber stamps on it. 9 different people had to approve. Now, once the first person approved, the other 8 pretty much went along with it. But 9 different stamps of approval to get on an airplane and come to Boston. Think about what level of approval would have been necessary to spend $2 million. He said, find us a company that's more hierarchical. And we found Motorola. And we described how Motorola ran their research facilities. But I would suggest to you that it was a very interesting thing because look at the difference in success between Motorola and Intel over the years. I would prefer to have held Motorola stock, Intel stock rather than Motorola, because Motorola at some point stopped being able to get out of its own way. And Intel has successfully continued to manage innovation very, very well. Interesting difference in terms of Fujitsu's inability to absorb or use the knowledge that it had about a competitor, or at least to adopt what the competitor was doing. They might be able to use the knowledge in some way, but they couldn't actually adopt the process. And I think that's an interesting lesson. You can learn about somebody and still not be able to make direct use of it. You may be able to make indirect use of it, and sometimes that's valuable enough. but you can't always expect to be able to copy what the other guy does. You have different capabilities, you have a different way of looking at the world. Senior management may have different goals. There are differences in companies that are immutable, which is one reason why it's very difficult to copy somebody else's strategy and succeed at it. Okay, this is, actually this is war story number 2. Some of you may be old enough to remember Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, who used to say to Gorbachev, well, there's an old Russian phrase, trust but verify. You know, we trust that you're disarming, but we want to verify that. Okay? So don't trust, and just verify is my advice. In 1998, Texmaco, a publicly traded Indonesian company, announced that it was going to build a factory and start to produce a generic version of polartec, a knockoff of polartec. And polartec was invented and is still made in Malden Mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And that's the factory, and there are some polartec jackets for you. Texmaco was a polyester fiber producer, and polartec is made out of polyester fibers. It's owned by an Indonesian oil company, and so, you know, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean to Malden Mills? Well, certainly. Well, let me ask you, what do you think the advantages are of Texmaco in a situation like that?
Raw material.
Raw materials, and assuming that they have that their parent company doesn't insist on selling the product to them at retail, they had complete control over their own supply chain, and of course they had relatively low labor costs in Indonesia, although there's not a huge amount of labor in manufacturing this particular product. So they said they were going to do this. Malden Mills wanted to know when. That was the question. When is the product going to hit the market? Why was that the question?
Long-term strategy planning. Are they launching next year or 3 years from now?
Okay, so,
That's gonna make a big difference.
yeah, Sandy?
The fire? The fire?
Fire?
Oh,
Oh, no, oh, this was before the fire at Malden Mills. Yeah, you have good memory, yeah?
The next product on the roadmap, and they were wondering if they could get it released to have a competitive advantage.
Okay, could they do something, could they sort of steal a march on Texmaco? But particularly they were thinking about capacity. Do we cut capacity, expecting that a low-price competitor is going to come in? How do we sell to people like LL Bean? Do we go out and try and lock them up in a long-term contract at maybe a slightly better price because we know this new stuff is coming in, and these people will try and get a piece of that market? How do we protect ourselves with reasonably certain knowledge that the competitor is going to come in and the assumption that the competitor is going to come in at a lower price? Right? So, what would the best sources of information be?
The reports they have to provide publicly.
Okay, so reports that are provided by publicly traded companies, because Texmaco is a publicly traded company. We'll come to that. That's a good answer. In this particular case, there's a little twist to it.
Biggest buyers find out.
Okay, so
The biggest buyers are.
if the company's getting really close, they would contact the buyers. Who do they get in touch with before the buyers?
Manufacturing property.
The equipment suppliers, right, okay. So the first thing is talk to the equipment suppliers, all right? So we started to do that, and then and then something very interesting happened. Oops, there we go. In December 1998, Texmaco put out a public statement, a PR announcement, that the factory for making fleece was ready to go. It was operative. And that was it was faster than we thought based on what we were hearing from from at least some other sources that we had. And we called up a guy that we knew in Jakarta. Everybody knows somebody in Jakarta, right? Called up somebody that we knew in Jakarta, and we said, go out there and take a look. And here's what he saw. This is the place where the factory is located. There was a goat in the field, grazing in the field, where the manufacturing site was. And in the back, actually, this is not the actual picture. Somewhere I have the actual picture. It shows a different factory making a different product. But the site, they hadn't even broken ground. And you think, wait a minute, this is a publicly held company making a statement that they had a factory ready to go. What's going on? So, okay, what was going on? Why wasn't there a factory there? Well, the Asian currency crisis had broken a few months before, and the Indonesian rupiah had dropped from 10 to the dollar to 100 to the dollar. And they had placed orders with West German and U.S. manufacturers of machinery, and the machinery manufacturers had taken deposits, but they were not willing to ship without being paid in full, in advance, in hard currency, because they didn't trust that even a letter of credit would be collectible. And I've had personal experience in situations like that where you have a certified, guaranteed letter of credit and you can't collect on it because the government says, sorry, there are no dollars available. So they were very much aware of that risk, and they said, we're not shipping, and so the factory wasn't built. And so you think to yourself, wow, so I can't trust the announcements of a publicly held company in Indonesia. And you think to yourself, what a tough place that must be to do business in. I have to verify everything. It's not just Indonesian firms that do that. Okay? They may not do it to quite the same extent, but here's AT&T announcing in the mid-'90s or late '90s that they were going to offer large companies a contract to take over their servers and basically operate server farms. So the sort of the way that Amazon Web Services does now. If you want to put up a lot of, you want to store a lot of data or run a lot of operations on Amazon's computers, you can do that very inexpensively, less expensively than running your own data center. AT&T said it had signed up. They said they had 4 confirmed customers, big company customers, and they named the companies. And they'd been trying for years to get into the computer industry, and they had a lot of cash, and they'd been free to do that by the 1995 breakup of the Bell system. They were no longer bound to stay in the phone business. And finally, they were getting into the computer business, and Hewlett-Packard wanted to know, what does this mean for us? Because we sell this equipment that are going into these data centers, the server farms as they were called then. And if AT&T becomes a major player, they're going to have a lot of leverage over us for price. And by the way, if they can make these systems more efficient, which Amazon has succeeded in doing, they can reduce the demand for servers, and then we're in more serious trouble. So what does AT&T actually have to do to launch the service? Go ahead.
We're gonna have to like find space and build a facility.
Yeah, you have to, yeah,
Stuff,
right.
you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that has to be, just like the people in Indonesia. They couldn't, having a goat grazing in the field doesn't make fleece. Well,
Right.
there's a fleece of sorts, I guess. If you wanted to, if it was an Angora goat. I haven't thought about that until now. That's interesting. So yeah, you have to. One of the things that you learn when you're doing competitive intelligence, trying to predict what a company's going to do and when they're going to do it, is before you can jump, you have to crouch, and you can see people, companies, competitors crouching. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world. But in this particular case, we looked at what AT&T said they were going to do, and it didn't look to us like they were crouching. And by the way, we went back to the 4 companies that they said they had signed up, and each one of them said, no, we haven't signed a contract. We've indicated interest if they get their service up, but it'll be a couple of years before that happens. And in fact, it never really developed. AT&T ultimately backed out of the market. So I say to you, well, Texmaco just flat out lied about what they were going to do. Well, AT&T sort of turned the truth a little bit. The lesson there is no matter where you are, no matter where your competitor is, verify. It turned out, whoops, sorry, I'll show you my last slide. It was vaporware, right? So, okay, third war story. Competition is typically dynamic. It's not static. Market circumstances continually change. Isoferrone is an industrial chemical. It's a solvent. It's based on acetone. And it's the feedstock for a range of industrial chemicals that are used in adhesives, in composites, in the wings of aircraft and the blades of turbine generators are made out of epoxy that's been epoxy fibers that have been coated with the fiberglass fabrics coated with epoxy resin and catalyzed, cured using a catalyst that's made from isoferrone diisocyanate, which is cyanate, which is at the end of the isoferrone chain. So, and these products also go into foam, insulating foam, and a range of products. Anyway, 3 German chemical companies really dominate this market globally. Bayer, BASF, and a company called Evonik. And they largely control the manufacture of isoferrone, and each of them has fairly substantial operations in China. The Chinese market has been growing very rapidly, particularly because China went into a very ambitious program of building wind turbines, and there was a shortage of IPDI at the far end as a consequence, and the Chinese government began to actively encourage companies, domestic companies, to go into the market, and they wanted to have domestic production rather than production controlled by foreign companies because they felt that domestic companies would serve the Chinese market first. And so they actually put it into the 5-year plan that this particular chemical chain was going to be something that they were going to encourage Chinese companies to invest in. And the Chinese competitor, Yantai Huanhua, it's a real name, a real company, had already entered the IPDI end of it. They had backed out of polyurethane foam, which they had manufactured. They had been buying the raw materials. They then began to manufacture IPDI, which is one of the raw materials. And they were beginning to develop the capability, the technical capability of backing down the chain towards isoferrone. And so the question for these 3 European companies was, what do we do? Now, 3 European companies, they've had the Chinese market in particular to themselves for really years. Bayer has had virtually uninterrupted operations in China for decades. And you could be sure that they were kind of cozy with each other. Okay? They didn't violate the antitrust laws, heaven forbid. But most of the isoferrone was produced by Evonik. The next chemical up the line, isoferrone diamine, was produced primarily by BASF. And isoferrone diisocyanate was produced mostly by Bayer. And Evonik bought some IDPI for something that it produced in another area from Bayer. So they had this nice cozy relationship. And you can be sure that the prices were profitable. What happens now? What do you think happens now? New producers coming in. Think about what the new producer is likely to do. So let's give you some guidelines about the industrial chemicals industry. It's an industry that both benefits from and is punished by economy of scale. Economy of scale gives you enormous cost advantages, but in order to achieve those advantages, if you add capacity, you have to add a big block of capacity. You can't add a ton, you have to add 15,000 tons in order to make the plant, an addition, another unit in a plant economical. And as the demand rises, in a nice slow curve like this, but capacity, therefore, goes up in a step. And what happens is that as demand rises, prices rise, the market gets tighter and tighter, and typically in the industrial chemical market, all of the producers sort of wake up one morning and say, we're going to add capacity all at once, and then they all go out and build capacity, competing with each other to get it online sooner, and they cut each other's throats with price in the next year when that capacity comes on stream because there's vast overcapacity. And then the cycle starts all over again. Okay? So with 3 companies sort of managing this market together, that wasn't happening. But now somebody new was going to come into it. So that's the cycle. And the Chinese market for petrochemicals is a very interesting one. The Chinese government has identified certain chemicals that it wants to have manufactured in China by Chinese companies. And here's the from the 5-year plan. The petrochemical industry should explore new paths to diversified development of raw materials, focus on the development of high-end petrochemical products, accelerate the adjustment of fertilizer raw materials, and promote quality improvement. That's right out of the 2011 5-year plan, and as you went into it further, it mentions isoferone specifically. So, it supports the development of materials, resource allocation to make it possible for this to happen. At the same time, chemical companies operating in China are asked, directed really, to provide enough capacity to meet the industry's needs, and companies in all industries are being pushed by the 5-year plan to become more efficient and competitive vis-a-vis global companies. The vast majority of large companies entering the chemicals industry, domestic companies, are not directly run by the government or by the national government, but very often they are funded by provincial governments. And some industries have been marked for privatization, but petrochemicals are viewed as strategic, and there's a significant continuance of government involvement in that industry. Okay? So again, what do you think Yantai Huanhua's goals are, recognizing the drivers of that Four Corners, the goals part? Their goal is to build up capacity, provide a domestic source of supply. And what about the goals of the other companies? Their goals are certainly going to be to maintain their profitability if they can. What are their assumptions? How will they act in the market? Anybody want to answer some of this? What does buyer who makes the product that they're already making need to know about it? What does BASF need to do? What would you do if you're the head of one of the European companies?
Maybe invest in a Chinese plant.
Oh, they all have manufacturing in China. Yeah, already there. Yeah, yeah. Actually, one of the things they were asking themselves is, do we add capacity?
Form a low-cost joint venture.
Form a low-cost joint venture. Okay, so low-cost is an interesting one because again, this is a industrial chemical product, and there's not a lot of labor cost involved, but capital cost certainly is there. So if you could team up. So that's very interesting. May I ask where you're from? Where did you?
Colombia.
Colombia. Okay. All right. So not the United States. And because I think that's first of all, that's the right answer in my view, and it's not a typical answer for a U.S. or a Western European company, certainly to come up with that sort of thought. But really, the message here is these guys are going to either break into the game, or you're going to invite them into the game. You've been nice and cozy with each other all this time. The profitability is going to have to go down. You're going to have to give up some capacity or some market share to these people. But if you can do it in an orderly fashion by forming a partnership with them and competing with them properly in accordance with the law and so forth, but just the same, cooperating, being a cooperative competitor, perhaps selling them something and buying something from them, you'll have a much smoother road than if you simply try to build some kind of barrier against them and prevent them from getting into the market. And that's something that I believe it's correct to say that 2 of these 3 companies decided that they were going to do, and the third one decided they weren't going to. They didn't want to participate in it. But it's a challenge to do that because the Chinese company had directions and funding from the government to build an independent capacity in isoferone. So they themselves had to be careful about the goals that had been set for them, basically. Just the same, developing a partnership seemed like the most sensible way to manage a deflation of the profitability of that market rather than let all the air out of it all at once. Okay. So, again, you have to think about, back to that Four Corners model, it's a wonderful model It doesn't matter what country you're in or what culture you're in. If you can use that model to think about the competitor from the competitor's perspective, think about their goals, not yours. Think about their assumptions. Think about their capabilities, and you can usually do a much better job than you could otherwise in putting together what they're going to do next. I think I'll give you just a couple of final words. One of them is each competitor plays the game a little differently. So you're going to play chess, so you sit down at the chessboard and you find that one kind of chess piece is a little different than yours, and maybe somebody else comes with the Scrabble tiles. They have different funding, they have different sets of goals. I'll give you an example. It's a U.S. example. Pitney Bowes makes postage meters, franking machines. They also make labeling and packaging equipment that they sell to catalog companies, and companies like Amazon or Land's End or LL Bean. Okay? And I was actually sitting in the office of the vice president of marketing when this conversation was going on about one of the senior salespeople came in and he said he was concerned because Federal Express had purchased some catalog labeling equipment and given it to a couple of large catalog houses. Free. Here it is. And Pitney Bowes made money off of these things. And the sort of the sense around the table was, well, it's not a threat. They really can't afford to do that. What do you think about that?
Head in the sand.
It really is head in the sand. So what? FedEx doesn't have to make money on equipment. They make money when you ship. And if they could put equipment in place, they learned that they could typically double their business with the shipper. So, hey, they can afford to put a lot of equipment in place. And that's a case where Pitney Bowes and other companies who were making labeling equipment came with chess pieces, and they came with Scrabble tiles. They had a totally different set of goals, different objective, different business model. They didn't make money from what they were putting in place that competed with Pitney Bowes. Pitney Bowes was collateral damage. It's worth remembering that companies approach markets for different reasons and with different things in mind. And again, it doesn't matter where you are in the globe. If you can understand what their set of goals are, what their capabilities are, what their thinking is, you can figure out why they're going to do something, and from that, what you need to do and how it's going to affect you. And the last comment perhaps relates back, it actually comes from, this is a slide that somebody in one of those German chemical companies gave me. We tend to think in the West of competing head to head. We're very direct. Chess is the metaphor for competition. In the East, and I don't want to overgeneralize, it was a terrible mistake to stereotype, but just the same, Eastern strategy games are games like Go, where you surround the other side and gain territory and squeeze them out slowly. So if you look at Komatsu, a competitor of Caterpillar, 20, 25, 30 years ago now, Komatsu went after Caterpillar by bringing in products that were around the fringes of Caterpillar's product line and entering into countries where Caterpillar wasn't particularly strong. And they built themselves up, they built their quality up, they built their knowledge of the market up, and then they moved into the next space and the next geography, to the point where they're a very significant presence now across the globe in construction equipment. So it's a different way of thinking about competition. The goal is still the same, gain market share and make profit, but you're not explicitly trying to attack the competitor. What you're trying to do is basically add to your own territory, add to your own share. And it's worth recognizing that in some parts of the world, companies think differently than they do in the West, and perhaps the most important piece of competitive intelligence you can do is figure out how they think. If you can figure out how they think, you can figure out what they're going to do. And that's my story. Thank you.